I'm Eric Schumacher Rasmussen. I am the conference chair for streaming media. I'm also chief marketing officer at Ideas. This is our 5th session of our 2nd day of our 10th Streaming Media Connect virtual event. These virtual events are great, but we're looking forward to being back in person again in Boston for Streaming Media East in May 18th and 19th to be exact, with the Content Delivery Summit and Streaming Media University workshops on May 17th. Website links are in the chat. Thanks again to our jack of all trades, Steve Nathans-Kelly. Click on those. The program should be up fairly soon for both Content Delivery Summit and Streaming Media East. And the early bird discount to register for both or all events is good until, I think, April. Don't quote me on that. It's on the website. Before we jump into today's discussion, a few more housekeeping notes. If you have questions for our panel, please enter them in the Q&A tab rather than in the chat. That just makes it easier for the moderator to keep them separate and keep track of them. If you notice that you have subtitles on your screen or a transcript, and you don't want that on your screen, you can turn that off by going to the bottom of your Zoom window, clicking on Live Transcript, and then clicking Disable Transcript. Mine actually says Show Captions, so if captions, transcripts, you can figure it out. And finally, all of these sessions from Streaming Media Connect this week will be available on demand starting next week. Just go to the link to our YouTube channel that Steve just pasted in the chat, or go to streamingmedia.com, click on videos, and click on conference videos. Excuse me, end of the day here. I'd like to thank our diamond sponsor, Signient, for sponsoring all of our sessions this week, and we have a brief video message from them right now.
Wherever content needs to flow, the Signient platform can move any size file over any IP network at speeds that can be up to 100 times faster than traditional transfer methods. More than 50,000 businesses use the Signient platform to send and share files, automate movement of data between systems, exchange content with global partners, and move content to and from the cloud. The Signient platform gives you the power to operate at the speed you need to run your business.
And excuse me again, I would also like to thank the sponsor for this session, Fortinet. In fact, John Jacobs from Fortinet was with us yesterday for a Tech Talk session, and he joins us again for this panel, where our panelists will be talking about the cloud versus on-prem versus hybrid dilemma. And it will be moderated by Nadine Krefitz, a veteran of Streaming Media Connects. Welcome, Nadine, and I will just hand over the mic and the camera to you before I cough again.
Perfect. Thank you, Eric. And I'd like everyone else to turn on their camera so that we can start off. We've got John, Loke, and Andy. And, one of the things that we're talking about today is really the cost benefit analysis to cloud, hybrid, on-prem. And realistically, some of this is theoretical, but some of it's really practical. And the theoretical is more like, you should think about this, but you might not be doing it yet. Anyway, why don't we start off? And I think that one of the things that we need to do is figure out what people are doing. In fact, look, why don't we start first? Like, if you've got a hybrid environment, what are you specifically doing in the hybrid environment?
Well, I think it depends on a little bit how you define hybrid.
Okay, all right. Well, define that first. Let's go there.
Yes. So hybrid can mean that you're doing some things on premise and something in the cloud, or it could mean that you're doing the same workload on premise and in the cloud. Most of our workloads are the first sort of situation that we have different workloads that run in the cloud than we have on premise. So we are a broadcaster. We have a lot of broadcast workflows that run primarily on premise. Most of it, of course, because it takes a while for that technology to be sort of updated, and a lot of it is a number of years old and weren't designed with the cloud in mind. And also, a lot of the workloads are for production broadcast and production of the broadcasts are sort of very easy to run on premise. You don't have any sort of bursty loads. You don't have a lot of customers accessing that at any given time. It's sort of the same workload. It runs day in, day out. There's no real peaks and valleys in terms of usage of it. And a lot of that for us runs on premise. Most of our of the services that run our direct-to-consumer offering, the service called TV2 Play, that runs in a cloud environment. And it runs in a cloud environment because a lot of that usage is very bursty in nature. You'll have a lot of people watching. If there's some sort of sports event going on, that'll bring a lot of viewers in. It could be that there's a news event that triggers a lot of people to watch our news channel. All of those things come with a much higher load in the peak periods than they do in the slower periods. And in terms of the news, that also brings a lot of load that's not necessarily predictable. We can sort of predict when we have sports events. Those are usually planned a fair bit in advance. But news events like the whole COVID and shutdowns in a lot of countries, that came with very little warning, and we wouldn't be able to sort of prepare for that. We have to be able to catch all those viewers when those events happen, and those workloads tend to run in the cloud, where we have access to more capacity that we can utilize at a short notice.
Okay, capacity and bursting. In fact, Andy, we talked about this on our planning call, and you were all over this. So tell us more about what you're seeing, obviously, because you've got media and entertainment clients all over the world, and you've also got some kind of perspective on this.
Yeah, look, X said it absolutely right. It's in workloads where you can't make a plan for it, such as a big news event or a natural disaster. It makes perfect sense to burst to the cloud. The other side of that coin is that for those sports events where you have known sort of peaks and valleys to things, you still don't want to over design infrastructure. In other words, you're not going to go stand up a Super Bowl's worth of infrastructure to drive your daily workloads, because you know that your capacity will sit idle. You'll need 5 for 15% of that resource, that same resource. And so it makes sense to design something where you can go deploy it in an environment that is not yours, a cloud of some sort, and burst and utilize the resources there. And then when the big event is over, you can pull back the resources that you're using to something that's more manageable for your day-to-day work.
Okay, so I like, for some reason, I like the idea of bursty. I just think it's great. But John, now what about your implementation? So are you mostly doing things that are in an on-prem environment, hybrid?
Yeah, we've traditionally been, an infrastructure on-prem, but like most organizations, both us internally as an organization, plus the customers I talk to, almost everybody's going to end up in some type of hybrid environment. I think there's a great analogy if you've ever looked at putting solar on a house. You don't build that for the peak demand that you have at 7 p.m. When everything's running. You build that really to flatten those peaks just enough so that you do have, sort of a flat baseline and those peaks that come up, but you can shave them off. And I think almost everyone's going to end up there. Our approach to it is we really want to make sure that there's security in all those environments, and it's as easy to implement across them. That's kind of the focus we maintain.
Okay. Now, one of the things I think about is with a traditional broadcaster, look, we were discussing this. You've got kind of one side of the house that's had a lot of on-prem equipment for years, and then you've got some of the digital or the cloud environments that are kind of bringing in newer software services, et cetera. So how do they cross over? I mean, how do you get people who are used to an on-prem environment actually working in the cloud?
That's an excellent question, because I think that's probably one of the big challenges. So a lot of the cloud infrastructures are run by teams that are coming from the sort of IT side of things, used to run other products in the cloud or software as a service model. And they, of course, bring some of that with them when they join TV2, and that makes it easier for us. Whereas a lot of the more traditional broadcast people aren't used to that sort of paradigm. And there's definitely some sort of knowledge exchange between us, of like the people who are used to the cloud environment, to say, why aren't you considering these workflows? And they'll go, well, can we actually guarantee the same things that we can guarantee for on-premise solution? And I think moving to a cloud is not necessarily just the lift and shift. And I think both John and Andy will agree with this. It requires a lot of work to educate people on how the cloud is different from on-premise. Security is a lot different. A lot of, I think, companies tend to view security, that if network security as, okay, we have a firewall and everything behind the firewall, that's fine. Whereas in a cloud environment, you control things at a whole different level. You also need to make sure that you actually don't run your workloads in the same way. If you have a workload that's just running in the cloud, but you don't scale it down when you don't use it, you're going to pay way too much for those workloads. And getting people to understand how those things are different than an on-premise environment, where it doesn't matter if you have servers that aren't running stuff at the moment, because you paid for the servers anyway. It's not really a cost difference, right? But it is in a cloud environment, and there's definitely work to get everybody up to speed on how they need to think different about those things. And that's where we probably, in some companies that have people that are used to those environments and people who are not, there's definitely a work to sort of share the knowledge and exchange those ideas.
Okay, so in fact, there's two different trains of thought here that we could follow. One is the security and one is the cost of working in the cloud and things. I want to get back to the cost in a little bit. John, why don't we just go a bit to the security thing and have you discuss what some of the questions are that people come to you about.
Yeah,
Is this...
and Luca's point is spot on, that there is, sometimes just an assumption that it was easy when you put a physical device in a premise and you said, well, everything in that building is behind this security device, say a firewall. We provide policy, have a nice day. Now that is so exploded from a cloud perspective, we try to get people, and the ones that have done the best job have said, they really approach it as an entire new installation for security services as a module, whether that's the cloud native or third party or usually some integration of the two, and say that is the point of enforcement and policy. And it should be the point regardless of where you move in, say, a cloud, sometimes even a mixed environment or hosted. And so that enforcement point becomes we don't want to use the term bottleneck, but it becomes the gateway for access in and out. And then you can deal with it inside the services themselves.
John, so if I'm doing some planning, what are some of the questions I should be asking about that are security related to the cloud? Because realistically, that's your focus. So what do you tell your customers?
Number one is, if you can start, you've got to start with a real identity solution and have identity and access part of it. So this isn't just people going everywhere. A lot of times we hear that from customers that say, which cloud vendor, what are we using? And people just sort of, we don't know, people are on their own. So first off, just having arms around it. And then I think second is to the point made of a baseline. Where do you anticipate baseline load? Because those costs are going to vary. To Luca's point, that a sunk cost people are used to. If we deployed a data center or a new office and we said we want an appliance and a rack, this is what we get. They spend the money and then they say it's spent. The beauty of cloud environments is that you could reduce that cost, have a baseline, and then enable it to burst. So sort of that future planning, or at least now planning for the future of where are we at, where do we anticipate, and then is there a scale plan in order? So I'd say those are the two things: arms around it, scaling model.
Okay. Andy, I'm sure people will sometimes say to you, hey, what happened? That got really expensive. Mm-hmm. What were people doing that made it really expensive?
Luca said it absolutely right. There's a mindset between the on-prem environments that you set up and the cloud environments, and it always invariably comes back to the pets versus cattle analogy that gets talked about. On-prem environments are pets. You spend a lot of money on them, you keep them up and running and maintained all of the time. And the cloud is effectively cattle. It is a resource that is there when you need it, and then it is turned off the rest of the time. And the first time that an on-prem engineer stands up environment in the cloud, fundamentally, they just can't make that switch to, I need to turn this off when I'm done. And so someone leaves a very expensive setup running over the weekend, and it's not being used. It's just sitting idle, waiting for the event. And so then they come back to this giant bill and they're shocked and amazed. And the reality is you have to get into that mindset of, I'm going to use scripts and good engineering practices, and I'm going to go deploy this when I need it, and I'm going to have a schedule that ramps it up, maybe an hour or two before the event starts. But then it's going to get torn down, a couple of hours after the event ends. And that's the cost-effective way of doing business in the cloud. Until you make that shift to thinking about how you go deploy services and when they should be up and when they can be idle, and then what parts of it are stood up permanently, and then what parts can be sort of pulled back down. That is the tipping point where you get into cost savings in the cloud.
Okay. Now, in fact, we're just talking about the cloud, hybrid, on-prem. What are some of the specific things? And look, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, and this is a question for any of you. What are some of the specific things that are done that are, say, in a hybrid environment? Why go hybrid on something? And Andy mentioned, and look, you mentioned bursty, but media related, what kind of use cases do we have here?
Well, considering this is media related, I think one of the good use cases in that scenario is encoding. A lot of companies will encode video that are just regular run-of-the-mill, will encode this every day about the same amount, and they'll budget for that and have on-premise equipment for that. And then suddenly you might license a new content catalog, and you need to ingest that within a certain time period. Well, in that case, you can run it through your normal process, but it might take a long while because you don't necessarily have spare capacity. And it's a relatively easy workload to burst into a cloud environment or run in a cloud environment and run it there and then return it back to on-premise. And it's also one of the solutions that I think is very well supported by a lot of the encoding vendors. They can sell you a physical box you can plug in a rack somewhere, and also the software will handle that automatically and move some of that workload of transcoding video into the cloud, because it's such a good scenario of something that you do in a sort of batch way, that you have all this stuff that you run through, and then once you're done with it, you can forget about it, just tear down all the cloud infrastructure and everything is fine. I think that's definitely one of the classic use cases for that.
Yeah, that's a great one. I would add on to that and say, if you're talking about live channels, disaster recovery is a very common workflow for the cloud. So if you're running, somewhere 10 to 15 channels of content regularly, it may make sense to, and they run like 24/7, stand them up, run them in an on-prem environment, but that becomes a single point of failure if for your content going out. So you would typically set up some sort of secondary site and source, and it's very easy to make that the cloud, so that if the signal goes down on the first facility, you get an outage, or there's a disaster in that area, an earthquake or something else, then the systems switch over automatically to that secondary space that it only gets, if it's in a cloud infrastructure, is only spun up for the time period that it's needed until you do the recovery and revert back to your primary sources.
Okay. Now, in fact,
sorry, I was just going to say, probably the most digestible use case right there, that we've seen so many people that just say, we're not going to spend this for a disaster recovery scenario, that it's perfect, right? It's there, it's available in cloud. Whatever they do from the first instantiation, it's on when you want it and then just off. So,
and for disaster recovery, is it more common to go multi-cloud or single cloud?
It's a great question, and it really is down to the comfort level of the sort of engineering group or the ops group. Often people will start with one, and then there will be an outage in that cloud, because even clouds have outages at times, and so they will make backups for the backups. And so it becomes a scenario where you likely start with an individual one, but you over time you have as many backups as possible. There's a reason I have 4 keys to my house strategically placed in places where I know where to find them. I like to have backups.
Wow. Okay. All right. So realistically, I won't try to get into your house because I'd have to know all the locations. Okay. So how are you going to manage all these multi-clouds in that case?
Yeah, there's it's that becomes sort of, as we start moving away from just on-prem and a single cloud to a multi-cloud scenario, there are a number of ways of dealing with it. On the one of the early ones that I've had some experience with was a package that Netflix originally created for managing workloads across clouds called Spinnaker. that they turned into an open source initiative. That's a great way of effectively managing multiple clouds and even on-prem environments in a single workload. We have similar technologies that are specific to Azure and Microsoft around how you manage Azure workloads and your on-prem workloads and make them look like seamlessly one set of resources, and we call that Azure Arc. And so there's a number of different ways to approach it, but definitely planning how you manage it so that you're not managing 2 or 3 different processes. You're managing a single process that points to multiple resources and multiple locations. That becomes the effort that you need to do.
Okay. Does anybody else want to speak?
Yeah, sorry. There's also very good tooling that can handle multiple different cloud environments from Terraform that can be used to set up infrastructure across clouds. That's very useful. I think one of the dangers is going the multi-cloud route is that you end up with a lot of implementation details being different. It's pretty easy to spin up just a virtual machine that runs in the cloud and having some sort of tooling to do that across clouds. That's not really that hard to do with the tooling that's out there. What's really hard is if you're using some of the more sort of high-level services in those clouds. It could, since I'm most familiar with AWS, it could be AWS Lambda or EventBridge, these function as a service kind of implementations. Those tend to be somewhat different between the cloud vendors, or at least not necessarily as easy to copy between them. So if you are running in a multiple clouds, you sort of have to either spend a lot of engineering time to adapt to the differences between them, or just decide to sort of dumb down your implementation and only use relatively well understood workloads that work more or less the same across different clouds. And of course, for each organization, those sort of trade-offs would be different. Some of them might go with, okay, actually, we'll spend the additional resources to make sure that this works across Azure and Google and AWS, even though the implementation details are somewhat different. Or some of them might go, actually, all our workloads run nicely in a tool like Kubernetes that all of the clouds implement. So it can look just about the same no matter which cloud we run on. But there's definitely still some implementation details that you have to sort of handle differently in different clouds when you're running multiple clouds.
Okay.
That's a great point.
John, did you want to mention anything about how your customers kind of deal with the different cloud environments, or is that something that's more kind of proprietary to your customers?
No, and actually, I mean, the way what Andy brought up is, we always recommend, if you've got the engineering talent and the ability, multiple clouds is a better redundancy strategy. As he noted, they still have outages. So I think that's number one is if you've got the capacity, do it. We've seen a burgeoning space of almost cloud network engineering is kind of this interesting space of there's companies now that will help you map applications and map the networking components across, because that's not quite as simple as it was. And then ultimately, our goal is to say the security posture should be the same. You should have the same policy that you can apply, the same access rules, the same identity policy. That's really the ultimate piece for us, and trying to limit that access, make it intelligent enough, and then react in any instantiation in really the same way, whether it's an on-prem or cloud.
Okay. So far we haven't really talked about money, which we should, because I think that's obviously going to be a big question for people. So
Comes up a lot.
what about, okay, so we have, you're starting to run something in the cloud, for instance, or you're running in a hybrid environment. What are some of the costs that come up that people might not factor in? Andy, you talked a little bit about this.
Yeah, well, like I said, the first thing is to make sure you're deploying it smartly, so that it's only available and generating a bill when you need it to do work. Therefore, in theory, you are also making money with it in some way or form. I would say the other way is to make sure you're being smart around elements like egress costs, being aware of the other charges that go into being in the cloud. Does the workload need specialty hardware like a GPU or a FFmpeg, or sorry, a FPGA card of some sort? Those are additional costs that may come in on the cloud side. I would say the opposite or the flip side of that is if you're deploying it on-prem, thinking about the costs that go into the operations and the maintenance and the electricity and the HVAC and all of the other pieces that go into that, you as the manager or producer of the streaming area may not have to worry or think about the infrastructure costs. But the reality is, if you're running something in the cloud, you're paying for all of the infrastructure maintenance and resource as sort of like one bill. And you have to think about those costs from like a CFO's perspective, because they're going to certainly be thinking about all of those costs when it comes together on that side. So there ends up being a lot of total cost of ownership conversations around like, how much does it actually cost me to run this? And am I remembering or thinking about all of the charges that go into it?
Okay, so what are some of the things that you should be thinking about to keep your CFO happy then? Like, what are the questions, Andy, that, for instance, you want to make sure that people are considering?
Yeah, well, I think I often when I get into these conversations with engineering leads or people that are moving new workloads into the cloud, it is that sort of apples to apples comparison, making sure we're thinking about, what does it cost to run this and operate it in the on-prem environment, and then let's compare that to what it's going to cost to run into the cloud, and then let's make sure that we're thinking logically about how often I need to run it. What does the maintenance look like on having new engineers that might have to have cloud, more cloud sort of architecture guidelines, or maybe having a team that manages CI/CD pipeline for doing constant deployments. Having all of those sort of wrapped into it so that we're holistically thinking about realistically, this is what it takes to run and maintain it, both from a technology and like build perspective, but also a resource perspective and operations perspective.
Okay, so how often something runs, what the engineering staff skills are, and how they're thinking about deploying what it is that they're doing.
Yep.
Now, Loki, you are in the position where you're within an organization. So, and do you get questions from people who kind of are thinking, hey, the cloud is more expensive just because they've maybe experienced that mistake that's happened where people have left something on which they shouldn't have? Or how do people talk about it?
I think that's not so much the questions we get. I think the questions we typically get is that, okay, actually, if we look at the cost of running the server, this is much more than if we just bought a server and put it in a rack somewhere. But they're, as Andy correctly mentioned, they're forgetting all the cost of building the cooling for that, building the sort of power for that. All that cost is sort of forgotten about because that's already been paid. You sort of, it's not a running cost as it would be in a cloud environment where it's a monthly or hourly cost associated with running a server. So they sort of forget to sort of calculate that as part of the equation. Another part that I think also changes this a little bit is if you're running something like a managed database in the cloud, usually the clouds will have stuff working with failover, all that stuff, making sure the infrastructure can swap out under it if something fails. That's stuff that requires system administrators to be on premise to manage the same workloads there. And it's something where you then have to make sure that you have that speciality of people who know enough about databases to make sure that they can manage those failovers correctly. And at least for us being in a relatively sort of small market, having enough specialists on all those positions is tricky to get, and is certainly costly to maintain compared to just taking some of these off-the-shelf offerings where the cloud vendors are the ones having all the specialists working under the hood to make sure those things work. So that's definitely also a thing that they need to sort of take into account when calculating, oh, well, this server is much cheaper than paying for this for 3 years. Yeah, well, maybe not. And also with regards to cost, I think it's important to look at some of the discounted options in the cloud and make sure to take that into your calculations. Google has this sort of discounts for stuff that run all the time. AWS has a version there where you prepay for a number of years if you know that your workload is going to be always having this base. And also making sure that you engineer for the different cost structures. So egress cost that Andy also mentioned is generally relatively expensive across clouds. But if you then have a CDN vendor, a lot of them now have possibility of doing cache in the CDN's network. That means that you don't have to go back to the cloud and pay egress cost multiple times for the same piece of content. So there's a way to engineer around some of the costs for sure.
Okay. And so realistically also what you're saying, it sounds like is that you're getting the expertise that you might not want to keep in-house, and you're getting it probably at a fraction of the cost as it would cost you to keep it in-house. And so that's something else to factor into the formula, we should say. Now, I've got a question from the panel. Let's see. One dilemma I had recently was about security and ownership. The cloud allows us to keep proprietary code on our servers. We are a cloud streaming platform. However, how might on-premise code be handled secured in the context of on-premise locations where more people have access to the code server?
And I wasn't sure if that meant from a physical access perspective. I mean, that's one problem, but I don't think we dwell on it. From a server perspective, I think there's ways to solve that. One, from a secure boot, I think that's a pretty common idea of now of just making sure that it's legitimate from start to running, and then pieces of security as they relate to it. Actually, the talk I did yesterday about zero trust is the initiative that, regardless of where that is, the right people have access to the right services only at the right time. I mean, that's really the model of zero trust.
Okay. Does anybody else want to speak to this question? Okay, I'm hoping that answered your question, Richard. So, realistically, we were talking also once about kind of design, and people say, oh, I can lift and shift this, but that's not really the case. We talked about containerized code. We talked about how people should be designing to make best use. And Andy, why don't you kick us off here and kind of give us a little bit of an overview as to how do people have to think about working in a cloud environment, and what's the difference between how they used to work?
Yeah, well, I alluded to it earlier in this sort of the pets versus cattle model. It is really a matter of stopping from thinking about like setting up a monolithic infrastructure and then working to constantly maintain it the way that I would like a car engine, or maybe a staff running a large boat or something. We have to stop thinking of it that way, and we start to thinking of it as an infrastructure that is built out of a series of scripts and can be deployed and can be ramped up or changed, or areas of it changed as resources are needed. So it's almost more of an organism, something that's continually sort of expanding and contracting based on the business and operation requirements that they go behind it. And it is a different it's a different mentality and philosophy. But it's things that can be learned, and media will almost always be a hybrid infrastructure at the end of the day. There's always, that media invariably, particularly like news and sports, is always going to happen somewhere in the world. So we're going to have to get signal into a cloud somewhere to do something with it. And therefore we're always going to maintain that connection. So it's being able to balance those two worlds that becomes the challenge for media operators out there.
Okay. What about in terms of the applications that people are using? I mean, should they be asking some specific questions from their vendors about how an application has been designed to be used in the cloud versus how it previously was designed to be used on-prem?
Sure. There's tons of known names and entities out there in the ecosystem that work across multiple clouds. We have partners that are deployed on other clouds and work in on-prem environments. I think one of the first questions which Lok brought up was asking about how what they're deploying. Is it specific to a cloud? Are they running something in a container? If so, what does that look like in a specific cloud that you have interest in working in, and where are examples of it running in that cloud? Because all clouds are not created equal. There are differences in the way they're deployed. They have differences in the sort of what their service level agreements for specific areas and elements are. And knowing the intricacies of those are very important, particularly if you're talking about a live video scenario. you're working in a VOD space, you probably have a luxury of more time between what was processed and what is being delivered. But in a live scenario, that's where all of the sort of ugly bruises and warts come out, and you have to figure out how to make it as seamless as possible, because at the end of the day, it's that qualitative experience that you want to deliver to the end customer, the viewer, that is the important part.
Okay, so now, Andy, I can't ask you the follow-up question because I know that your expertise is within.
No, go for it.
Okay, well, you say all clouds are not created equal. So what are some of the things, and I'll share this with the rest of you guys after I talk to Andy about this. What are some of the things that you have to be, you've been asked about clouds being not equal?
Sure. Well, I mean, look, there are literally things like the downtimes for when an error message is found, or what the capacities for specific VMs or other elements. Even the VMs that are deployed are fundamentally there are just differences in the sizes or like GPUs that are attached to them. So there are always differences. So if you've designed something to know that it's going to work specifically this way on a specific VM in AWS, you now have to go map that to Azure as part of your thinking. You can assume that, well, if it works on this version of this, it should work on that. But until you go test it, you're not 100% sure, and you're relying on supposition, which is a dangerous game when you're talking about your business operations. So those are certainly pieces of it that come into play in the conversations that I have. Where I end up then spending a lot of time is, how do the other services that the cloud inherently brings, how is that removing other friction from what I have to do? In other words, can we rely on the implementations we have in our identity and security, which just are inherently a sort of horizontal function of things at Microsoft and Azure, that we can apply to the workloads that we have? Or what are the AI capabilities that we're exploring that can also be brought in to either the workload directly by a customer, or something that's integrated in by the ISV to make something easier that they need to do? So that's probably where I spend the majority of my time versus apples to apples comparisons of the other clouds these days, fortunately.
Okay. Now, okay, I would say that I would hope nobody just runs something without testing it ever. But
you'd be surprised, man.
Okay, well then, okay, look, so let's move away from the representative from one of the large cloud organizations.
Totally fair.
Okay, so you know, if you're thinking about running things in one environment, and you said which one environment you're using mostly, you know, would you ever, I mean, what's your thought process to, if you had to go to a second environment, what would you do? Like, how would you think about it?
Well, there's definitely parts of it that's figuring out which implementation details are different. One of the things that's very different between the clouds is how they do sort of access management and sort of user privileges, that sort of thing. That works very different. There's also going to be services that look almost the same. All of the clouds have some version of block storage that you can use pretty much, but the implementation details might vary a little bit between them. So for one cloud, it might be you might get better performance if you access the storage one way, and that might work differently across them. I think it's also going to be very different between looking at databases. So there's definitely some areas where we know that we're probably going to need to do some research if we want to run the workloads in a different cloud. They definitely also have, in our view at least, different strengths and weaknesses. Google has been very good at having a lot of very high quality databases that we can use, that's not necessarily as present and is easier to use in AWS at least. And there's going to be other areas where we know that things will be not necessarily better or worse, but just different. Networking is also one of the areas that work pretty different between clouds. So it's going to be a lot of research to figure out, do we need to adapt to that, and how much do we need to adapt? And also, if we're using software that we didn't develop, how well will that work in a different cloud environment? And in general, it's part of when we look at software that we use, we run through some of the questions as well for how does it actually run in the cloud environment. Andy mentioned this as well. There's going to be things like, is the software made for in a scenario where we have the cattle approach instead of pets? Can we kill these servers off with no problems? And some of that is going to be the same across clouds. And then again, some of the stuff like, how do we handle scaling? Those mechanisms are going to be subtly different looking across clouds. And we would need to sort of make sure that we don't get hit by any surprises. Since I'm most familiar with AWS, one of the things there is that the load balancers can scale up, but they don't necessarily do it instantly. You can pre-warm them, but that's an implementation detail that's very specific to how AWS work, but might work a lot different in a Google or a Microsoft cloud. And there'll be some of those areas where we need to figure out, okay, how do we not get bitten by some implementation detail that's not immediately obvious? So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, and I'm going to go back to, I hope you're not you, to a person. I hope they would be testing this out. So, and realistically, because you're engineering and because you're architecting something in one area, you would probably want to look into all the different aspects of it. But you mentioned, actually, I'm going to go back to the access management because John has kind of some thoughts on this in terms of when you are looking at, your staff and access, what are some of the things that kind of come up? And what are the things that people really have to watch for?
Yeah, I mean, the great part is that's one of the huge benefits of cloud or, a hosted environment. You can write off all of the lower level tasks, right? Access and physical and badging and all that. That's great. But from a true application access, this is one of those key things that really we encourage people at the very start of planning. If you're a born in single cloud, use all of their services, this is easy. Right, use their identity services, maybe some third-party tools, but ultimately, most companies, as we've mentioned, are going to end up using multiple clouds, multiple instantiation types, and really start the conversation with that in mind. And as part of the architecture of whose services are we going to use, whether that's the primary cloud you're using or your own services that you carry with you, or subscription, whether you just buy that service from a third party, not an issue, but know which of those are going to be in place that build that foundation for access. So where does the identity come from? Where's this policy role or a policy broker? Maybe that's your security vendor. Maybe that's, again, a third party. Maybe that's the cloud provider. All of them have pros and cons. There's no right or wrong for any organization. Ultimately, though, starting with that in mind, having that as part of the initial conversation, we're going to use service A for identity. We're going to use service B for policy. And we know that it applies to these cloud providers. And then we'll use maybe one of theirs or a third party, again, for collecting that information back, logging, monitoring. Microsoft does a great job with their Sentinel platform. But, if you're in multiple cloud, maybe that's a third party again. So.
Okay. Now, one of the things we wanted to talk about is kind of some of the costs, because realistically, we talked earlier about don't leave certain things running because that will just scare your CFO. So what are some of the things that people need to think about in terms of their qualifications for their staff? So look, you started talking about this a little bit, but in terms of working, especially in a multi-cloud environment, what are the skills that you look for in other engineering staff? Like, what do they need to have or be willing to get?
Well, they definitely need to be able to sort of look at a world where the infrastructure is going to be abstracted away to a certain extent. They can't necessarily rely on servers and the way servers normally work. They have to work with it and understand the infrastructure is fluid. They might run code on a server that just gets pulled from right under them because we scaled something down, right? So they need to understand that, oh, actually, if we need to persist it, we have to think about persisting it in some sort of database layer somewhere. We can't just put a file locally and sort of assume it'll always be there because that server will always be there. So there's definitely sort of, they need to think in a different way than a lot of engineers have been used to, because things work differently. And then they also, I think, need to care more about the infrastructure around them. A lot of developers will not look at networking as something that's important for them to know about. But in a cloud environment, it becomes important both because of security. You want to set up security groups that allow you to only communicate between servers that need to communicate, and they need to think about those and understand what, well, if this isn't working, why is it working? When we need to deploy this, we need to also stand up infrastructure that has the security built into it, and being able to care about a wider field than I think a lot of engineers are normally used to. And I think that applies no matter which cloud they're working on, and especially if they're working with multiple clouds, the networking infrastructure and deploying it across different networking infrastructures are going to be even more important to understand. So I think looking for engineers that are happy to sort of have a little bit of take a wider view of the world than what they've been used to so far, I think is what I would go for.
Okay, so we're not going to kill Andy's cows off. We're actually going to ask
What if I have
people
cows as pets? I really want to know if
I know. I'm not sure I want to kill these cows. So, okay. So realistically, if we have engineers taking care of animals, they have to be open-minded enough to know that the animals might need to get fed or let outside or something like that. That's the end of that kind of analogy. Okay.
Husbandry. Then we have to go down that tangent.
Okay. So what about other questions you should ask your vendors about their cloud services? So I want to wrap it up just because we only have a few more minutes, but so realistically, if you have a vendor, and we'll start this with any of you actually. Yeah, you're using a vendor that say, and they're like, this is what we have in this cloud or whatever. What are some of the kinds of questions you should be asking them?
I think
so that both you understand the money, the security, the functionality. Andy, do you want to?
Yeah, understanding how they've deployed cloud technologies. Are they running infrastructure? Is it PaaS, platform services? Or is it a SaaS model where it's just running in their environment and I'm buying the service? Like how is it being deployed within the cloud? Because that will change it. I think understanding if you are getting into something where you're not just buying their service, but you're actually deploying or building out some infrastructure. What does that infrastructure look like? What are the technologies they're using? Is it Puppet? Is it Chef? Is it Docker containers? Is it Kubernetes? What are the underlying pieces so that I know I have the right people who speak the same languages and work in that space so that I'm not getting out beyond my skis in an area that I need to focus on. And then I think that Loke said it, the networking is the other big piece of that, particularly as we start talking about these regions or these workloads that span sort of two clouds or a cloud and an on-prem environment, knowing that I've got the VNets or the VPCs set up in such a way that security is maintained and I don't have a leak in it, but everybody has access to the stuff that they absolutely need. And I haven't broken something by having the security sort of overly onerous in an area where it didn't need to be.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, to Andy's point, that know what they're building and how they're building it, because it's going to impact cost. It's going to impact where you do what interfaces you have, how they can interface. Make sure if you need them to be multi-cloud, that they are multi-cloud. Then they can move or shift and pivot as you do as an organization. I'd go back to the one thing when you talk about cost, and I would only circle for 1 second, and that is, does the organization want capital expenditures or operational expenditure, CapEx or OpEx? That's huge. For some organizations, want all of one, none of the other, and there's no right or wrong answer, but you sure should know that upfront.
Okay.
Huge difference.
But realistically, if, for instance, you're not considering certain cloud services, you're also removing your capacity in certain areas, aren't you? Meaning that, for instance, like I was talking about, do you have a database engineer who can actually deal with one thing? If you're going to restrict yourself and not either create a hybrid environment or a cloud service of something, you will not be able to benefit from the cloud opportunities. We'll
Right.
go into that.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not that I'm working for a cloud provider right now, but I'm just suggesting that
Neither are. Yeah.
there's a number of questions to consider. Are there any other questions that you would bring to your vendors that we haven't chatted about? Loki, what do you think about, like, when you're talking to a supplier about a particular thing, whether it's in coding or whether it's we talked a little bit about AI and ML, but what are some of the things that you think about in your mind about, you know, the way to evaluate someone? And this might not be the formal evaluation, but it would be kind of like, these are the things I want them to know about.
I think we tend to ask questions about that's about some of the deployment pieces of the software. Stuff like how is configuration managed, for instance, is usually one where we sort of, oh, actually this configuration you have to go in and apply manually. You can't really do it automatically. That would be a red flag for us. We want to automate the deployments, and we want to be able to stand up environments automatically. So that's definitely would be something that would be a deal breaker for us. Stuff like how do you handle, how can we monitor the health of the service, and how can we monitor that we're getting close to some sort of limit of what the software can handle, so we know which points to monitor for scaling, for instance, would be another question to ask, to sort of understand how can we operate this in different environments. And you probably want to scratch the surface quite a bit, because a lot of the vendors out there will definitely say, oh, actually it works great in the cloud. But when you ask more specific questions about, okay, well, how does this software that runs on multiple servers figure out how to talk to each other? How do they discover they both run in the same cloud environment? And that's when you sort of start to get answers that might be a little bit hand wavy, and that would be something that I would definitely dig more into. Yeah.
Okay. Andy, what about some of the things that you say to people, since you may be on the other side of things?
Gosh, I mean, for me, it really becomes a matter of making sure I understand their business problems and the business priorities. In other words, what is the bigger death knell for them? Is it being down for 2 seconds, or is it quality degradation? Because that allows me to know where I need to focus the attention and where we invest it. Is it in infrastructure? Is it in better quality, or is it in better, faster networking pipelines? So I think understanding where the levers and where the gives and the gets in how they go deploy, because invariably that is different for every customer, so that we can make recommendations around what is the best practice specifically for them as they begin to approach the cloud.
Okay. Now, and over the course of our conversation, we've talked a little bit about live, and we also talked about somebody bringing in an archived library. So realistically, we've got these different kind of use cases. And Andy, do you ever hear about people who have a lot of live services, and they're saying, I want to have this all on-prem?
Sure. I mean, there are traditional companies that we work with that were doing video before there was such a thing as the cloud, and they started it on-prem, but they want to find ways to use it. Likewise, we work with some new companies who started in the cloud as more of a streaming, but as they grow, maybe it makes sense for them to migrate part of their workloads into a data center, because they know it's going to be this sort of steady state 50 to 70% of the time, but they know how to connect it to a cloud so that they can manage those workloads in two places. So I feel like I've seen them all at this point.
Okay, so realistically, it sounds like what you're saying is that if you have enough services that you're running and the cost is a certain range, the on-prem way is going to likely be something that is going to be predictable, going to be affordable,
if you have predictable ways of managing the work that you know you're going to be doing, there's certainly value to doing it in on-prem. That said, there's always going to be reasons to have the ability to burst it to the cloud. And then if you know that it's just highly unpredictable, then there may be reasons to leave pieces in the cloud because you have the ability to manage the cost vectors there a little more granularly.
Okay. All right. Loki, you have the advantage of being in an organization that has a broadcast and a streaming delivery environment. So realistically, when you started using cloud services, what were the things that you had to kind of educate the broadcast side of the house on that the cloud services were able to do that they might have previously been doing on-prem?
Well, I think there is a number of issues, a number of areas where we sort of have inspired them a little bit. I think one of them is that we now have event-based channels that we can spin up and spin down, for instance. So if we want to cover the Olympics or Wimbledon, for instance, we can spin up live channels that we run for these specific events where we can cover much more than we would be able to do with the normal channels, and we can spin them down again, and that doesn't cost us a lot because it only runs for a very limited amount of time. That's, I think, a use case that we wouldn't have thought about if we came when we were heavily on-prem. Other things that come to mind is sort of running things as a experimenting more. It's easier to do it if you don't have to go out and buy hardware. You can easily spin up an experiment, run it for a short while, and then discard it again if it doesn't work out. That's probably also a use case that we wouldn't have done in an on-premise environment, because then again, out and buying hardware that we don't get to use a lot of usage out of. So there's definitely areas where I think thinking differently about it is beneficial.
Okay. And I'm sure realistically, the way you depreciate hardware is a certain format and a certain mindset. That is going to be a very different conversation. Now, do you guys have any questions for each other just before we wrap up the presentation?
I don't think so. I feel like we're all on the same page. We we sort of agree about. I feel like we've all had these conversations enough that we have the battle scars that emotionally at least prove it.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no single right answer for everybody, and you know, hopefully we're here to support what people want to do their best.
Okay.
Agreed.
Well, Eric has come back, so that usually signifies the
That's the
end
cane.
of our session.
That's-
Yes.
That's the signal.
Okay. Eric has come in from the cloud, however.
I have something like
Yes.
that. Yes.
I know. Well, you
Um,
have. Anyway, well, thank you all for coming and talking about this. And hopefully it's been an interesting conversation for the audience. And anybody who has questions to want to follow up, please get in touch with me or get in touch with the panelists. Thank you, Eric. Thank you all.
Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Andy, John, and Loke. And thanks to Janam Shah, who was we think was the first person to guess the song right.
Okay.
Isaac Hayes is Hung Up on My Baby, although Wasim Ahmad was there a fraction of a second later, but Wasim left. So Janam, keep an eye on your email toward the end of the week for that gift card. And thanks again to Signiant for sponsoring all of Streaming Media Connect, and Fortinet for sponsoring this session. We'll be back at 10 a.m. Eastern tomorrow to talk about the future of interactive streaming. See you then.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Bye.
thanks.
See ya.